2 minutes past. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Snack and Learn webinar on Biodiversity Net Gain. Before we get into it in detail, a few housekeeping notes. Slides will be available from the handout box in the control panel. Please download those and go through them at your leisure. We'll also be recording this, and the recording will be made available from our website, and a link to that will be circulated via email to attendees. We are planning to have a short Q&A session at the end, so please log your questions in the question box in the control panel, and we'll address those at the end. So without further ado then, I'm Jonny Miller. I've been at WSP for about 4 years. I'm an associate and leading the Biodiversity Net Gain work for WSP in the UK.
I'm Hannah. I'm a principal ecologist or consultant, and I also assist to lead our approach to biodiversity net gain at WSP in the UK.
Thanks, Hannah. And both of us are going to be speaking today. And whilst WSP might be well known as an international multidisciplinary consultancy, we've also got one of the largest ecology teams here in the UK of about 170 ecologists. And within that, we've got a large, 13 full-time equivalent people working purely on biodiversity net gain, and we have been running this for several years now. We provide both biodiversity impact assessments on a wide range of development types, but we also provide the more advisory services, so the tools, strategy, guidance and training that helps our clients embed and address biodiversity net gain in their operations. And we're really going to be drawing on this experience in our webinar today. So in terms of what we're going to cover today then, we're talking about making biodiversity net gain possible. We're going to be focusing on the UK and particularly England, and drawing on that experience I've alluded to, and seeking to summarise some of the key actions needed to get ready for the new mandatory net gain requirement that I'll introduce in a bit, and particularly drawing on a case study from SSE. It's great to see we have a few international attendees on the call, and I hope this will give a new perspective to your work. And we're seeing biodiversity no net loss or net gain as a real growth area in many countries as governments and corporations grapple with the global biodiversity crisis. And whilst the detail that we're going to talk about may vary somewhat to your country and between countries, the challenges and solutions are often very similar, so I hope there'll be some real relevance there. But in terms of what is biodiversity net gain, just a really quick introduction. So it's a process and an outcome to development that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than before. So the key word there is measurably. It's a quantitative approach relying on a metric. And in England, we have a spreadsheet-based tool providing that metric. And that metric is used to calculate the biodiversity value of a site pre and post development to determine the outcome for that scheme. And where there are residual net losses, then these can be resolved by design changes, or they can be compensated for, whether on or off site, to achieve either a no net loss, as you see there, or a net gain if we go beyond the no net loss requirement. And this kind of quantitative approach really provides clarity, consistency, and a level playing field for all those involved in the development process. And to make BNG possible to a consistently high standard, we really need good guidance, good standard, and tools and policy to support us as a kind of framework. And in recent years, we've seen a rapid growth of this guidance and standards, and we have yet more still in production at the moment. And even Natural England released another document just on the 30th. So it can be quite daunting for practitioners to keep up with this bevy of documents and to navigate their way through. But it is essential to provide that strong framework. And we also need a strong regulatory driver. Biodiversity and planning is a devolved issue in the UK. So we have different policies in place in each of the countries that make up the UK. But in England, we have probably gone the furthest in those regulatory terms of the 4 countries in the UK. And over the last few years, this planning policy has become progressively clearer in relation to biodiversity net gain and more stringent. But then in November last year, the English government passed the Environment Act, which, amongst other things, will make a minimum of 10% biodiversity net gain a legal requirement of most development in England. Gains, it sets out that gains must be calculated using a standardized metric. That's the metric I referred to before, and that those gains must be maintained for a minimum of 30 years post-development. It also requires a nature recovery network to be set up to help target gains in the best locations for biodiversity. The Act isn't going to be implemented immediately. It provides for a transition period, and it is coming into effect in November 2023 for the majority of development, and for what we call nationally significant infrastructure projects, it's expected to come in sometime in 2025. It's quite high level in places, this Act, and it provides for a raft of secondary legislation that will set out the detail of how it will work in practice. And we're just closing consultation today, or government is just closing consultation today on what this will include. But work is already clearly underway to set out a range of tools to support its implementation. And that's not just the metric, that spreadsheet-based tool, but and that is due for update even in the coming weeks. But it will also set out a net gain site register, data standards, some templates, both from a reporting and management and monitoring perspective. And indeed, the government will be offering a supplier of last resort mechanism. So lots of work is being undertaken at the moment alongside that, and it really is paving the way in the UK. So what does that mean for the rest of us? Well, fundamentally, this is a huge shift in how we assess and mitigate for development impacts. Arguably, it's the most significant piece of legislation for wildlife in England since the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981. So it is a landmark shift. It's not perfect, and it's still very much evolving, but it is still significant and positive. And through this consultation, hopefully, it'll be improved even further. And indeed, it paves the way for the use of other tools to assess wider benefits from our green spaces, from carbon sequestration, water quality, etc. And with this shift is a massive need for new skills, new capacity, and potentially accreditation. Definitely, as ecologists, we need to up our skills in identification and in undertaking the assessments using the metric. But all of us, consultants through to local authority and landowners and managers and brokers, need to increase our capacity to undertake the assessments, to review those assessments and monitor and enforce the agreements on land, and indeed to bring forward land to be delivered as offsets. Ideally, well, possibly there's going to be some form of accreditation, and hopefully that will help keep our assessments accurate and realistic, so that the outcomes are positive for biodiversity. And from a wildlife perspective, we've already seen biodiversity net gain reinforcing the mitigation hierarchy from our work to date, even before it's being made mandatory. And through this, we've seen better design with reduced impacts and better outcomes for nature. On the face of it, this is still relatively new, and so there is still a need for long-term studies to confirm results and ensure that it does it provides the best that we can. And Biodiversity Net Gain is already introducing significant new investment in conservation. Research that we undertook with FTech for DEFRA identified that the market for off-site biodiversity units could be worth around £135 million a year, requiring around 6,000 hectares of land, again per annum, to deliver the offsets. So you can see this is a significant amount of money and land that could be given over to nature. So it's clearly a huge opportunity, but also a huge challenge for all those involved, because it is coming into effect, into mandatory requirement in 2023. So we've only got about 20 months to go. So what do we need to do to get ready for this? Well, I've already talked a little bit about some of the things that central government are doing and need to do, such as around the regulatory framework, governance, and strong and effective tools. But there's, and I've also mentioned the need for new skills, capacity, and accreditation. But I'm wanting to summarize a few more measures that some key actors can undertake over that next 20-month period to help get them ready for mandatory net gain. So firstly, from a regulatory perspective, even with this wealth of national guidance and policy we have, there's still a need to supplement this at the local level. This could include setting more ambitious objectives, such as choosing 20% net gain rather than the national 10%, or it could be defining local conservation priorities for avoiding impacts and targeting gains, such as through those nature recovery networks. And even that, they should be looking at how biodiversity net gain can deliver wider policy or corporate priorities, such as public access or flood mitigation. And all of these should really be undertaken in consultation with local stakeholders, such as the community, and linked to local planning policies. From a developer perspective, developers should consider biodiversity net gain as early as possible in the project lifecycle. Assessing net gain outcomes at the site selection and feasibility stage can really help to identify and manage risks, and those risks to both program, budget, and the consenting outcome. And this is especially in the context of a relatively new and potentially volatile offset market, so some uncertainty around supply and pricing. And for large schemes or portfolios of schemes, there are often opportunities to aggregate gains over space and time to achieve efficiencies in transaction costs and land areas required. So the real benefits there to the developer. And then finally, from the landowner and land manager perspective, there's a need to understand the landowner's site or sites in relation to local conservation priorities and in relation to other revenue generating opportunities, such as agriculture, carbon offsetting, etc. And by assessing the baseline and predicting the potential supply, it should help the landowner make better investment decisions over their land use and help with marketing their potential offset capacity to developers. So clearly there is overlap between these actors and actions. Developers can have some undevelopable land that they can turn into offsets, and regulators can benefit from supply and demand modelling to inform their planning policies and any interventions in the market. But across all of these, there's a real need to embed BNG into the processes and decision makings of their operations. And this requires really good understanding of the BNG process, so keeping a pace with all that guidance, but also really good communication across all of these different actors and throughout the project lifecycle to ensure smooth delivery of the net gain process. Now, Hannah's going to give us a case study that really exemplifies some of these actions.
Thank you, Jonny. Yeah, it leads really nicely how organisations might embed or try to embed biodiversity net gain into their operations. So we're going to just talk through a particular case study where we have attempted to do that with our clients. So SSEN, that you can see on the screen there, that stands for Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks. They are a major energy business responsible for the electrical transmission network across Scotland, and they supply electricity to Scotland and the rest of the UK. They do have the name is a trading name which covers other businesses, including one in England, and they're regulated by the UK regulator, which is called Ofgem. So they're an interesting case because they essentially fulfill a number of roles that Jonny outlined just in the previous slide. So they are a developer, so they have projects, they construct infrastructure. They also own land because they operate their infrastructure, so a lot of the land that they do own. And they potentially have new roles with the way that they have now gone down this approach to biodiversity net gain, which I will get to. So we worked with SSEN, and it occurred, or their story began quite naturally, really, with one of our own consultants who was just very passionate about work done elsewhere on biodiversity net gain before now, principally internationally, but starting to develop in the UK, and decided to bring this to Scotland. So this is different because this developer is principally based in Scotland, and so Scotland does not have or for the very moment doesn't have a mandatory biodiversity net gain requirement. So they were more infused, or their driver to undertake this initially was really based on perhaps seeing future trends, having that foresight, perhaps wishing to be a leader in their industry, as well as increasing pressure from Ofgem to start to demonstrate other benefits that they have for the public. So they did some initial testing and they started to get some initial success with this biodiversity net gain approach. So at this stage, I can bring a bit more of my knowledge because they wish to embed this approach across their operations. So in doing so, we produced multiple bespoke tools. That was done together between the ecology and sustainability teams here at WSP. We produced guidance, we did training workshops, and some of the other outcomes of this is that, and a key one that our client loves to shout about, is that as a result of this, and one of their early sites, they've actually had visiting species of bumblebee that are actually very rare in the UK. They've also had some sites that have seen massive net gains, one in particular getting to 90%, which is excellent. A brief overview of the tools that we actually created. So there's a number here. One was called the Optioneering Toolkit, which essentially meets their project life cycle's feasibility stage, so the stage that they go through when they are selecting sites and trying to determine which ones they're going to take forward. And the toolkit there is quite a basic toolkit, but it allows them to get that initial information that they need. The toolkit after that is called their project toolkit, and this is the toolkit that is very similar to the English metric, so it's based on the English metric. It's not exactly the same as the English metric. And there's Scottish specific reasons for that. But this toolkit they use to measure their net change in biodiversity, so they use this to assess the baseline and the post-development designs, and they work out what the net change is there. This particular toolkit has won awards across Scotland and also in the UK, and part of the reason for that is the way that it's designed, which is possibly or arguably from some people's feedback, easier to use than the English metric, the way the English metric is laid out. We produced a GIS template for them because spatial data is going to be massively important to the way that biodiversity net gain work is continuously assessed and monitored, being that repository, that data set that is there, that archive, that's going to be very important in years to come. So making sure that a standardized spatial data template is available to our client for use amongst their different suppliers is really important. We then have a reporting toolkit. So this then meets their requirement for their corporate reporting. So a way that they can gather the information across their project portfolio, bring that together and assess, are they on track with these various projects? Are they meeting commitments that they have set out initially to achieve net gain targets? And then there's a landscape habitat management plan. So this is the template that sets out the habitats that are required to be created, enhanced or retained, how that's going to be done and who's going to do it, and for how long each of those habitats need to be managed and monitored for. I'm aware of the time, so this is just a brief infographic on how we actually undertook a massive survey of the entirety, pretty much the entirety of the SENS estate to give some initial baselining information, which will hopefully allow SSEN to start to develop that capacity as amongst their own operations and their land holdings to either have potential to be offset providers in the future, or else be able to offset their projects internally. So that is ongoing still. And then finally, some key innovations. I did touch on this earlier, as well as being a different layout in terms of the actual metric and how that works. There have been different approaches that have been specific to the Scottish context, which SSEN has developed, and that has been done in consultation with relevant stakeholders in Scotland. Apart from that, the way that they've done this work has been very influential, and they've shared the way that they've done their approach beyond immediate stakeholders across the industry, and it has gathered a certain amount of momentum amongst particularly Scottish organisations where there is that devolved responsibility for policy and legislation. And because of that, and in recent times where policy is being relooked at, there is a lot of support for this approach. So in England, getting to the stage where we have with the legislation that's now in place, did start from grassroots in terms of from the bottom up, and important to that were the developers getting on board. So it may be, and I would be biased because I'd like it to go this way, that Scotland ends up going a similar direction to England. So we will see what happens there.
So then just to round it up then, I think we've shown how this is biodiversity net gain is a big opportunity, but also a big challenge. And we've shown through that case study as well that the tools and templates are so important to from an individual client perspective, but also from a national perspective to ensure that standardization and efficiency. And that these could possibly be improved on using technology such as web-based calculators or innovative data visualization and decision support tools can really support developers and landowners in making those choices. And of course, we can incorporate wider, more novel data capture techniques to support larger scale monitoring across the UK. But we've talked about how the legislation, policy and standards are really important for that standardization, and the real need for new skills and capacity across the sector, and the steps that a number of key actors can take to prepare themselves for the November 2023 mandatory net gain requirements in England. We'll leave it there. We've got only a couple of minutes for questions now. Sharon, have we had any in the chat function? I'm not hearing Sharon.
Maybe, were there any other ones we could?
Well, I'll crack on with the first question. So we did have one from someone called Rico. The question of funding comes to mind. Where will additional revenue for projects come from to cover the costs of offsets? So our research has shown that, at least for large infrastructure projects, the cost of delivering net gain is, including any offsite compensation, is around 1% of the project costs. So it's relatively small, and I've heard it cited as lower than that as well on individual projects. So the costs are relatively low, but in terms of where the additional revenue would come from, that would be from realizing efficiencies within the development or construction process, or in realizing some of the land value, or capturing some of the land value. We've got time for one more.
Yeah, I've got there's one here. I'm just seeing. Oh, we've got loads. Let's go for this one. Can you see a point where land may need to be CPO'd? I think that's compulsory purchase ordered to help a project achieve biodiversity net gain. Do you foresee any implications for the planning process with that?
I can't see, as much as I would love the ability to take land that I think is right for nature. I can't see that coming about for the main reason that, unless there's a significant change of CPI powers, for the main reason that we can deliver gains for biodiversity. There's flexibility within the metric and the process for delivering gains for biodiversity, so that it's not just one field delivering, being the only field that can deliver those kinds of gains, except in rare exceptions where it's linked to particular species or very rare habitats. And in that instance, it's outside or additional to the biodiversity net gain framework, and is really captured better within wider legislation and processes. So I can't see there being a move to increase CPO powers to buy net gain land.
Thanks, Jonny. We do actually have a little bit more time. We can take some more questions. There's another one that's quite a good one here. Would you know if and how biodiversity net gain is approached in marine and coastal systems, for example, for sea defences? That's a really good question.
Yeah, really good question. I know a lot of work has been done on this, or at least there has been a working group looking at this for a little while. We don't tend to get that involved in marine projects, but I know that Natural England is looking to develop tools around this and a metric and guidance around this, and so it's more a case of watch this space at the moment.
Brilliant. There's another question here, quite a quick one, I think. Is the 6,000 hectares across England or the UK in that study that you did?
Good point. I might have conflated the two. Across England.
Yes. Okay. Brilliant.
And that 6,000 hectares and 135 million pounds a year. The detail behind that is available in a report that is available online from the same location as the current and closing today consultation that government is running on biodiversity net gain, so easily accessible.
Great. We have another one here. Do you think we will see any positive planning weight given to projects which offer large biodiversity net gain values? I think that we may. I think like the planning system, as usual, has to weigh up different competing interests. I think we may, where the biodiversity net gain work can be shown to provide multiple benefits. So we haven't touched on what goes further and beyond biodiversity net gain in the UK, but which is on the horizon, and that's environmental net gain. So looking at those other environmental factors that will be really important, not least given the IPCC report yesterday in terms of sequestering carbon, which habitats can offer. So there may, in the right location, possibly be positive planning weight. Jonny, did you want to put in there as well?
No, I agree. If a development not only is able to give large BNG values, but also deliver them in the right locations that can deliver wider benefit, I can see decision makers appreciating and valuing that. But ultimately, in England, this will be a mandatory process. So there will be a minimum process that needs to be gone through. And ideally exceeded. And it's worth remembering that this is minimum at a national level, but there will be local and potentially more stringent policy that needs to be adhered to as well.
Thank you, Jonny. That's actually all we have time for now for questions, but thanks for those. They're really good questions. As before we mentioned, the handout is there for you already to download, and the recording will be supplied via email post this session. So we hope you've really enjoyed being with us today, and we hope you will join us for future Snack and Learn webinars.
And if we didn't get